As promised, I'm continuing to soldier through and look at all of the potential Democratic candidates for 2020. One of them stands out from the rest in terms of being a complete joke, and that person is Tim Kaine. For every other candidate, I can kind of see a path to victory, even if that path is a bit narrow, but for Tim Kaine, it's not there. And in fact, Tim Kaine, to his credit, seems to understand that, and he has said that he has no plans to run for president in 2020 or ever. However, I think there's still a pretty good possibility that he could get pushed into the race by his donors or by some of the apart sheiks within the party who want to put him up and think that he has a chance because they fundamentally do not understand politics. So let's look at Tim Kaine as a candidate and then laugh accordingly. Tim Kaine has a few strengths that could help him win a nomination or a general election. He has strong support from the establishment, and his vice presidential run with Hillary Clinton would really solidify that. There were articles on the web talking about how he used to be really attractive when he was in his 20s, so that is obviously a strong selling point and something that is extremely relevant to the public. Because he has such an ability to not be noticed and keep a low profile, it is possible that if all the other candidates somehow imploded, that Tim Kaine would keep such a low profile that he could make a late surge and clinch a nomination at the last minute. He also does have a winning electoral record. The only election he's ever lost is when he was running with Hillary, which doesn't really count against him, to be fair. He also is not Adolf Hitler. Generally speaking, Adolf Hitler is not very popular in American politics, and Tim Kaine is not Adolf Hitler, so he's got that going for him. And in addition, he is also not a registered sex offender. So that is a huge plus and something that will really make him stand out from the crowd. The first problem that Tim Kaine has, which to be fair is not entirely his fault, is that he's a Virginia politician, and because of just how centrist all Virginia politicians are, that makes him extremely boring. Now, there has been an article written in the last year or so about Kaine and Senator Warner arguing that they're actually liberal, but I don't buy it. If you look at how they voted on the most recent Dodd-Frank rollback, both of them voted in favor of doing that, and it shows that their true allegiance is corporate, and no one who is a corporate Democrat can be considered a liberal. I guess if you want to look at the neoliberal wing of the party and then rank them left to right, then maybe Tim Kaine is on the left of the neoliberals. He certainly seems to be a bit to Hillary's left on foreign policy and a couple other things. However, that's not a very distinctive or interesting position, especially when he comes from what is increasingly a safe blue state. The only really interesting Virginia politicians are Ken Cuccinelli, who's a right-wing lunatic, and Jim Webb, a centrist who switched parties back in the mid-2000s and talks about the people he killed in Vietnam. Other than those two, most Virginia politicians are pretty damn difficult to distinguish from one another, and it's not even clear, just listening to them speak, what party they belong to. Economically, they're pretty much all Republicans and or neoliberal Democrats, which basically economically is the same thing. Not a lot of difference there. Democrats in Virginia are pro-choice, pro-education, not necessarily paying teachers, but they're for, say, preschool, and they're in favor of gay marriage. So when you vote Democrat in Virginia, you're voting on maybe 3 issues. And Tim Kaine is just a typical Virginia politician. He's boring. He doesn't really give you anything that you couldn't get from 12 other people in the exact same way. Speaking of Tim Kaine's history, his main claim to fame right now is that he was Hillary Clinton's vice presidential nominee for 2016 on a losing ticket. He actually was selected by both Bill and Hillary, both of whom saw advantages to picking him because both of them are big fans of identity politics, and they thought that Hillary needed a white man to balance out her ticket. They probably also thought that you needed a Southerner. If you look at what Barack Obama did twice, he did not pick a Southerner, and he did balance out his ticket, though, by picking someone who was older. Obama got criticized for his youth, and had foreign policy experience in Joe Biden. Joe Biden also has some links to labor and Pennsylvania, and by extension the Midwest, and sort of the union scene. So Joe Biden brought a lot to that ticket that people tend to underappreciate. Tim Kaine is ideologically very similar to Hillary Clinton and didn't really balance out any of her weaknesses. He's younger than she is, but he's not a younger candidate, so he doesn't balance out her age issues. He's not distinctly more liberal. He doesn't have a distinctly different foreign policy, even if he's a little more to the left than she is. He doesn't have any distinctive issues that he brings, like his efforts on education are often touted, but are fairly indistinct and small scale. Basically, one of my contentions about the 2016 election is that it was close enough that a whole lot of small errors cost Hillary the election, and one of them was picking Tim Kaine instead of someone with some kind of labor appeal or someone who could rally progressives in some way. Had Hillary picked a better running mate, then 2016 would have turned out differently. And I think that it's pretty clear to everyone except the most hardcore Clintonista that Tim Kaine was a poor pick and he brought nothing to the ticket. It's really hard to argue that someone who didn't bring all that much to the ticket would really be able to carry a ticket by himself, especially given his performance as the debater during the vice presidential debates. Since FDR, a successful Democratic candidate has to have charisma and or a strong platform which fits the public mood. So Harry Truman wasn't considered all that charismatic, but his platform was in line with what the American people wanted. John F. Kennedy, his platform was a little vague, and a lot of people would concede that he got his ass kicked by Nixon in the debates when it came to argumentation. However, he did have charisma. Tim Kaine has no charisma at all. And he's also not really associated with any strong issues that would really make him stand out in some way, that would distinguish him from the crowd. He can't really sell a platform to the American people because he's not associated with a platform at all. He's never really had a strong one. So if he did come up with one out of the blue, he wouldn't know how to sell it, and he wouldn't come off as all that credible, as someone who waited until they're about 60 before they decided to get some issues. He's not going to be able to make it, and the thing about charisma is that it can't be taught. So he never has had charisma, and I think that there's a 99.99999% chance that he'll never have it unless our society shifts in such a way that our basic perceptions of reality change and the nature of charisma therefore changes dramatically. To build on what I said about charisma and the public mood, I do think that there are moments in time where people who are not traditionally charismatic can really stand out and make a name for themselves. Kind of small windows of opportunity. Sometimes these changes are permanent, other times they're temporary. So, for instance, Bernie Sanders was not considered charismatic before about 2015. But then the message that he had been preaching for decades suddenly started to catch fire as people began to awake to the fact that the policies that the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party had been pushing for years were not working. So right now, Bernie Sanders is considered charismatic, and just being yourself and not really having a lot of polish is considered charming and authentic, whereas before it'd be considered boorish and second-rate. So let's look at Tim Kaine's appeal, such as it is, and then compare it with what we think will be the political landscape in 2020. In 2008, Barack Obama, who has very good political instincts, said, Tim Kaine has a message of fiscal responsibility and generosity of spirit. That kind of message can sell anywhere. And by the way, had I known about this quote at the time, I would not have been hoodwinked into thinking that Obama was a progressive. This whole idea of combining fiscal responsibility, a Republican value, with generosity of spirit, a nonsensical talking point, is neoliberalism 101. At any rate, in 2020, based on what we can see now and the unlikelihood that it will change given that Trump or Pence will be in office for the next 2 years, Democratic voters in the American public are concerned about income inequality, which keeps getting worse, especially with that tax bill. Money in politics, which almost everyone now understands is a major problem. The wage gap between productivity and what people actually do, the work they put in, People understand that they're getting underpaid. The environment. At this point, the majority of the public understands that global warming is real and it poses a massive threat to our future. Healthcare, at this point, a majority of the American people want a single-payer system, the kind of thing that Bernie Sanders advocates for, but the Democratic Party as a whole will not get on board with as of yet. And also, a lot of people, maybe not even a majority, but a whole lot of people are really concerned that we're fighting unnecessary wars. So these are things that voters would gravitate to, both in the Democratic Party itself and in the broader American public. Tim Kaine is not all that strong on any of these things, although he has said a few things about our foreign policy that are encouraging. However, he is a lot more anodyne with his criticisms of our foreign policy, and I really just can't see him competing to make himself out to be a star if he has to compete with people like Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard to be the main messenger of that point of view. So let's look at his record and stances, and this is basically me disagreeing with the aforementioned article that says that Kaine and Warner are actually pretty liberal. So Kaine has a good rating based on his voting record, and he calls himself a conservationist. However, he also has been consistently in favor of fracking. And this includes opposing an amendment by Kirsten Gillibrand, which would have added federal regulation to fracking fluid that does not currently exist under a law from 2005. You know, a Bush administration legacy. They never regulated anything that was environmental. So Kirsten Gillibrand, who's not exactly a left-winger, was proposing this because fracking fluid in New York can potentially damage the groundwater. And Tim Kaine voted against that. He said that we don't really need the regulation on this. And as I mentioned earlier, he also voted to loosen the regulation of Dodd-Frank and allow 30 of the 40 biggest banks to not be as closely monitored. But in the past, he has said explicitly that he is in favor of strong financial regulation and that he is a champion of keeping the banks in line. Well, apparently that is a lie. So Tim Kaine has labels that a lot of people will attribute to him that he simply doesn't deserve. If he is either a regulator or a conservationist, then he certainly is not a very good one. And primaries tend to favor people who can pass purity test. If you're going to say that you are something, you damn well better be able to prove it in the age of the internet. And for Tim Kaine, for every time that he has gone out and fought a good fight for the causes he supposedly believes in, he's also put the knife in the back of the same people he's supposedly fighting for. So I just don't see how his record would hold up to any degree of scrutiny. Like Jerry Springer, I have final thoughts. And my final thoughts on Tim Kaine are that the man simply has no chance of winning the Democratic nomination. It won't happen. Primaries favor people with clear platforms, charisma, debating skills, and energy. Kaine is 0 out of 4 on those key traits. And that way, he is very much the Democratic Jeb Bush, except that Jeb Bush at least had name recognition. Tim Kaine is not obscure, but he's also not super well known. He doesn't have the name recognition Hillary had going into 2016 or that Bernie has now. And as someone who is basically a neoliberal, even if he's sort of on the left end of neoliberalism, he would probably be forced or urged strongly by his advisors to try identity politics. But the thing is, if you're a straight white dude, that's not going to fly. He would get accused of being a racist and a manipulator from day one if he tries to play identity politics. Now, Hillary Clinton was able to get away with it because she was a woman. But if you're a straight white guy and you talk about identity politics, people don't take you seriously. And if he were to get nominated somehow, like maybe there's a brokered convention or the other candidates, after he drops out, like somehow a stadium collapses and they all die, and then they go to the person who was the most recent dropout and it happened to be Tim Kaine. Like some weird coincidence happens and he's the nominee. He's one of the worst possible nominees the Democrats could possibly come up with. He's liberal enough that conservatives will consider him to be a smarmy liberal douche and a threat to their liberty. But he also is not liberal enough to excite most Democrats. Remember, most Democratic voters are way to the left of their party. And the fact that he doesn't have a strong platform would also fail to inspire independents who tend to gravitate towards strength and clarity. That's why they voted for Obama, who had a stronger message than his opponents, and that's why they gravitated in some degree towards Trump, because for whatever else his other flaws might have been, his slogans had verbs in them, unlike Stronger Together. So, anyway, I think that Tim Kaine is one of the few Democrats who would maybe have a 50-50 chance against Trump, if not a little worse. Actually, I think the incumbency advantage would mean that in a Trump-Kaine matchup, Trump might actually have about a 55 or 60% chance of winning, despite his innumerable fuck-ups and failures as a president. So those are my final thoughts on Tim Kaine, and if he is nominated by the party, I will change my registration to the Green Party and never look back.